How can political decentralization help to solve some of the structural problems in South Africa? Well, I was joined for a wide-ranging conversation by Dr. Ernst Roets of Lex Libertas and Martin van Staden, Head of Policy at the Free Market Foundation. I hope you enjoy this discussion. Yeah, so Ernst, what is your diagnosis of the problems in South Africa? And I think in many respects people obsess over the symptoms, which are very well known. But maybe we could get into what are some of the underlying causes of those problems.
Yes, so Lex Libertas is a new institution. It was founded just a few months ago. And we present it as some form of a combination of a think tank and an advocacy group. But our main focus is on the political system. And what we say is that we believe South Africa we need to promote the idea of self-governance in South Africa. And so we published one of our first reports earlier this year entitled Reclaiming Freedom. And the first point we make is that there's a lot of talk about the crises in South Africa, not just a crisis. But we believe the appropriate way to think about these crises is not so much as the crisis in itself, but rather as symptoms of a deeper rooted crisis. And so what is typically viewed as the crisis in South Africa would be high unemployment, it would be crime, it would be corruption, lack of government accountability, and so forth, unresolved issues regarding land and all of these type of things. And our argument is that actually the underlying problem here is that there is a political system that, even though in theory it looks good, in practice it has become very detached from realities on ground level for a few reasons. One is the country is very big. We just know South Africa as South Africa, but compared to other countries, and one way to explain it is is just to consider the distance, for example, between Cape Town and Messina. Is basically, I was in Budapest last week, and I said to them, it's basically the distance from Budapest to St. Petersburg.
It's about 2,000 kilometers.
Yeah, and the width of the country is from Budapest to Bordeaux. So the point is, the country is almost the size of Western Europe. So that's why it's a very big country, but it's also very diverse. I mean, Canada is a big country, Russia is a big country, but South Africa is much more diverse in these countries. And it's not just diverse in terms of different languages, but also different expectations, for example, in terms of what the government ought to be doing. Different conceptions of property rights, things like property rights, different views on how to interpret the constitution and so forth. And so that leads to friction. Practical example, there are many practical examples, but one is when the constitution says you have a right to access to housing. That is interpreted by some as that you cannot be prevented from having a house or having access to housing. That's sort of the more Western interpretation. But then there's another interpretation that says you have a right to have a house. And if you don't have access to a house, the government should give you a house. That's how you get access. And so it's the size of the country, it's the diversity of the country. And then the fact that the government has become in many ways detached, also because of the poverty. And the poverty in the country is very relevant because you can have a situation, I think South Africa is in some ways entangled in a situation where, ironically, the type of democracy that we have in South Africa incentivizes bad policies and bad governmental decision making. And what I mean by that is if democracy is simply a supply and demand system, and you have a person that is unemployed, living in a township, for example, cannot find work, and you have two parties coming to that person. The one says, vote for us and we'll ensure freedom in the marketplace, we'll make sure that you can employ people and so forth. And the other one says, vote for us and we'll give you money. The question is whether you can blame that person for voting for socialism. So it's voting for short-term solutions that in the long run is bad for the country.
And you argue that that's baked into the incentives of the current system.
Exactly, yes. And another example is the type of bad decisions that we've seen President Ramaphosa making. We published a report recently. I think that the title is The Many, Many Commissions of Cyril Ramaphosa. And the conclusion is, from what we could gather, he has, since he became president, established at least 34 commissions to look into issues in South Africa. And we have, the famous Zondo Commission, and now that's national dialogue and so forth. And we believe maybe the most important reason why he is doing that is because he knows that if he takes the decisive action that is necessary, for example, prosecuting, ensuring that senior government officials who are corrupt are prosecuted, or rethinking BEE, it will be the end of his political career. So he cannot do the right thing because it would be bad for him as a politician to do the right thing. And these are problems entrenched in the system. And so we believe the answer to that is to have a decentralized system, and that could take different forms. But the idea of recognizing the size of the country, the diversity of the country, and promoting the idea of self-governance, governance that comes sort of from the bottom up, as opposed to a top-down approach.
Yeah, and there are many large countries, as you point out, like Russia or Brazil, that maybe don't have the same kind of contradictions, but the geography and the plurality of the polity in South Africa also creates a lot of these contradictions. And I think your point around who bears the costs of bad policy decisions is really important.
Yeah.
So maybe some poor chap in Messina who is dependent on the public healthcare system, if a politician comes to him and says, well, vote for me and I'll give you free healthcare in the form of NHI. And who's going to pay for it? Well, it's the guy in Cape Town, 2,000 kilometers.
Yep. Yeah, and if you were to take like a compass and put it in Messina and take the size from Messina to Cape Town and you sort of make that circle, we can just look at how big that circle is. It goes up to, I think, Zambia and some other countries up north. And so you have the situation where people you could hypothetically be born in Cape Town, grow up in Cape Town, become a member of parliament, make laws, and vote on laws and so forth that are applicable to the guy that lives in Messina, that, as you said, it's like someone in Bordeaux making laws applicable to someone in Budapest. And that is why it's necessary to recognize the size and diversity. And I mean, I, for example, grew up in the north of the country, and it was not even a joke. When I was in school, I used to think of Pretoria as sort of the far south of South Africa, because you drive for a whole day, at least it felt like a whole day, it was 4 hours or so, you drive south and then you get to Pretoria, and then okay, I'm at the southern tip now. And the other day I was driving through Limpopo, where I grew up, and it's actually a very big province, just Limpopo as an example. It's a province that is the size of a country in many ways, but it's not recognized as such. It's seen as a small piece of a very big country that has this, at least in practice, a very centralized government that in many ways is detached from, for example, the realities in Limpopo, just to use that example for one.
I mean, I think something that always strikes me is that for reasons of history, South Africa has a country within a country, Lesotho, and everybody just naturally assumes that this is a sovereign state with its own independent agency and sovereignty. But if you had to say to somebody, oh, well, let's absorb Lesotho into the broader South African body politic, people would say, no, what are you talking about? That's absurd. And if you had to say, well, would you like to pay 2% extra tax a year to support the poor of Lesotho, people would think that you're mad.
Yeah, exactly.
But we actually are implicitly behaving in that way because of this kind of unitary state that was created in 1910.
Yeah. And it's a geographical thing, but it's also a cultural thing. And there are other countries that grapple with the same issues. And what we see, so the notorious Bella Bill or Bella Act is a good example, because the Afrikaans community see that as a very clear and obvious assault on Afrikaans as medium of instruction. And then now you can ask whether they are honest about their intentions or not. But if you ask at least the ANC guys who are pushing this bill, what do they aim to achieve? They would say, no, better education and so forth. It's very clear that the bill is not going to achieve a better education system. But the point is that there's not sufficient recognition of cultural diversity, and the fact that there are different communities living in this country that speak different languages, that have different cultures, and want to see those things preserved. But what we have currently is almost an imperialistic, ironically, an imperialistic system that seeks to convey the message that to be a true South African, you have to abandon these cultural proclivities. We have to be, again, ironically, we have to all be English. under the banner of anti-colonialism. And there are other countries that have the same type of problems, with countries with multiple nations, you could say, living in those countries. And generally what tends to lead to more stability is recognizing that diversity and respecting it, as opposed to seeing it as a risk or a threat. And I think, unfortunately, I can't even count how many times people who are affiliated with the government or the ruling party have said to me that it's time to abandon your Afrikaner identity and become a South African. And the irony of that is it creates a backlash. The backlash is that you have a stronger affinity to your cultural identity, and you are less patriotic about you could call statist identity. And again, the way to overcome this is recognizing this also in the way the government behaves, and recognizing this in the way the political system is structured.
And who decides what that national identity is. And if you go against that, then you often are subject to quite severe criticism.
Yeah, and what if someone else prescribes to you what your identity should be, it doesn't work. It just doesn't work. And the thing is, a person can have multiple identities. You can be a part of. So again, in Afrikaans, a good example is the Afrikaans-speaking community, which is not the same as the Afrikaner community. The Afrikaans-speaking community is bigger. It's not so much a cultural community, it's a language community. So you can be part of the Afrikaans-speaking community, but you can also be part of the Afrikaner cultural community. And there are many people who are part of the Afrikaans-speaking community who don't see themselves as Afrikaners. And if you tell them they are, they would object to that. And I think the way to deal with that is to give people the freedom to identify with what they identify, and to recognize that diversity, as opposed to telling people what they are and what they are not.
Yeah, and the ability to opt out is also important.
Exactly,
yeah.
Yes.
So Martin, you're a constitutional scholar. To what extent do you think that the constitutional framework in South Africa exacerbates some of these problems that we've been talking about?
Yeah, look, I think that we've made the point at the Free Market Foundation for a few years now that South Africa is on paper formally a federation. It hits all the qualifying criteria for what is a federation. It's the authority of subnational units are enshrined in the constitution. The president isn't the boss of the premiers, and the premiers aren't the bosses of the mayors, etc. But what we've also said is that it's a federation without federalism. Though the constitution might say one thing, we have a party, and I would say maybe a political elite more broadly, that governs, that does not share the presuppositions that underlie those formalistic kind of requirements at all. So the example that I often go to is in the United States, for instance, there's one reference to private property rights in the whole constitution, and it's a very passing reference. It says that no one may be deprived of their property without just compensation, kind of, it's an expropriation provision. And yet, because the cultural, legal, political elite in that country had such an affinity for private property rights, it almost became a defining feature of the American constitutional tradition, despite there only being this little passing reference to it. And in South Africa, it's almost the opposite. We have this federal structure, we have a very detailed property rights provision. But when you go and knock on the door of the union buildings, on the houses of parliament, and you ask the people who work there about what are you doing to push for a more perfect realization of federalism in South Africa, they'll look at you like you're completely insane, and they'll be like, no, we're a unitary state, what the president says goes, etc. So we have a structure that, as Ernst says, does not in fact reflect the reality on the ground. But what I appreciate most about the initiative of Lex Libertas and of you, Ernst, is that you've basically, or I think you're trying, I'm not sure if you've succeeded yet, but reviving a discourse that's been in South Africa for many years, for many centuries, I would say, since the mid-1800s. People occupying the various states of South Africa and then the Union have had this discourse about, is the system adequate to our reality? There have been discourses around federalism, about confederation, about separatism, etc., which all just suddenly somehow stopped in the 1990s. And then everyone just said, well, this is the system now. And to question the system today is almost treated as if, well, I mean, they often call it treason, which is bizarre because it never used to be that way. Debating whether we are being governed in a satisfactory way is such an important thing to do, because I think increasingly more and more South Africans, even across these community lines, are realizing that in fact something is wrong. And I don't think people are able to articulate precisely why that is. Yes, unemployment, crime, but these are all problems that other countries solve, and somehow South Africa just isn't getting there. And I think once you dig deep, you'll find that the source of that problem is in fact the system. There is something wrong in the very structure of how South Africa is governed. And I think something to say about this idea of kind of we're not allowed to discuss it and how the ANC, specifically the ANC, presents it, is that in fact more decentralization does not mean less patriotism. Again, to take the example of the United States, it was precisely because the provision was made for the retention of autonomy on a local level that people felt an affinity for the federal structure. They felt that this was something that guarantees a certain autonomy to them and to their way of life, and through that engendered a kind of patriotism. So the idea that if you allow more local areas to govern themselves, to be responsible first and foremost for what's happening in their area, drives people apart or creates division, that's not necessarily the case. In fact, it might create more unity if you let people be themselves, live out their cultural values in safety and security in their own areas, and then be able to cooperate with each other on a voluntary basis. That's what we prize at the FMF, is this idea of voluntarism. And there is going to be that backlash effect if the state continues to try and push people, not necessarily together, but push people into this homogenized political ideology, which is the National Democratic Revolution, and really a very insidious form of socialism.
Yeah, if I can add to that, perhaps a historian can help us, but I think it's not that far-fetched to say that race relations in South Africa was much better before the Anglo-Boer War. Yes, there were wars, and there were wars, and the Battle of Blood River and the Anglo-Zulu War and so forth. But there were also, and today we don't talk about that, but there were many cases of cooperation, even treaties, the famous Piet Retief Treaty, but that's just one out of many examples. Treaties between different communities working together and cooperating and helping each other out and so forth. And so I mentioned that because we sometimes get the criticism that, oh, okay, so we see what you guys are trying to do. You actually want to take us back to the apartheid system when you talk about decentralization. And it's actually exactly the opposite. Because what this current system has in common with the apartheid system is that it's highly racialized and it's highly centralized. And what that is also what the apartheid system had in common with, you could say, the system before that. And so when South Africa was a union, or the Union of South Africa, before that it was a variety of republics and colonies and kingdoms and so forth. That was all. It became the Union of South Africa, and that, before 1948, became a highly centralized, racialized system. And that, interestingly enough, is actually when and why the ANC was founded. It was in response to the unionization of South Africa. It was in response to centralization, saying that centralization takes away our rights and our freedoms. And so that was a highly centralized, highly racialized system, which was then replaced by the Republic in 61, or you could say the Afrikaner, or the apartheid government, which was also highly racialized, highly centralized, which now became the ANC government, which is also highly racialized and highly centralized. And our argument is actually that we need to step away from these two factors that really defined the previous three, or the current system and the two systems that were before that. It's not about returning to a previous system. It's about returning to a basic truth, which is that there's an amount of diversity in the country, and in order to deal with that, we need a decentralized system, as opposed to this sort of one-size-fits-all approach.
Yeah, and an organization like the Free Market Foundation, we're obviously a classical liberal group. We believe in individual freedom and autonomy and agency. But people do also, often on a voluntary basis, see themselves as part of a broader group, whether that's a cultural group, a linguistic group, or an ethnic group. And I think the important word there is voluntary. That people willingly associate or disassociate themselves. And I think, as we've pointed out in this conversation, there is this homogenizing, top-down kind of approach that the current political system enforces throughout society. and that creates a lot of aberrations and a lot of dysfunction. Interestingly enough, we're recording this episode at Northwood's house, which is on the ridge at Parktown.
Yeah.
And just beneath us is Valley Road, which has the highest concentration of heritage homes in South Africa. And one of those homes is the Moot House, which is where a think tank took place. It was a collection of intellectuals who basically drafted the Selborne Memorandum, which formed the intellectual blueprint for what then became the Union of South Africa.
Yeah.
And the road down from Valley Road is Epping Road, which is where Jacob Zuma had his Forest Town house. So I'm willing to bet that the architects of the Selborne Memorandum didn't anticipate that somebody of the character of Jacob Zuma would one day occupy high office and be part of the dysfunction of the centralization of South African politics. And we up here on the ridge, Northwood's house, are trying to decentralize South Africa again and federalize it. So some interesting historical analogies there. But yeah, tell us a little bit more about Lex Libertas and how you want to instrumentalize some of this work and what you're looking to achieve.
So we have published a plan recently. We call it our business plan, but it's more a political plan than a business plan. And part of the concern that we have found is just strategically for us as an institution is the objective sounds very far away. It sounds to a lot of people at first glance almost outlandish or unrealistic. Or the Silicon Valley term would be it's a big, hairy, audacious goal. Which and it's good to have a big, hairy, audacious goal. And so we, in this plan of ours, we say, how do we think? We actually think it's achievable, having promoting actual tangible self-governance in South Africa. And we believe that there are 5 things that ought to be done to get to that. And they need to be done as, again, in Silicon Valley terms, as sort of a flywheel, 5 interconnected steps. And you need to do all 5 continuously, and they need to support each other. And so the one is the think tank part. It's research. And so we need to do 3 types of research. The one is research about what's happening in South Africa at the moment. So what is the current situation? The second is what could a better system look like, or a better South Africa look like? Theoretically, you could say, or taking from the lessons that we've learned over the last few decades. And then the third is how do you bridge the gap from where we are to where we need to go? And the thing is, that a decentralized system could take different forms, or autonomy could take different forms. But so that's the think tank part. We need to think about that and talk about that. The second is local awareness and local support, garnering local support among the various communities that live in South Africa. And that, I think, it's a big hurdle, but I don't think it's as big as people think, because people are very fed up with what's happening in the country, very frustrated. And I've been speaking to a lot of, for example, black podcasters in South Africa, because people tend to think, oh, it's the white people who want to decentralize. But what I find is that our message resonates across the spectrum if you explain it and you talk about it. And I think there are a lot of communities that are marginalized in South Africa, black African communities that agree that they need some form of self-governance. So, but we need to do local support raising. The third is international support, because this is the type of thing that needs international recognition. And we saw, for example, the impact that international recognition has had on the political change in South Africa in the 90s, and now with, for example, the conflict in the Middle East and so forth. So you can't do this type of thing without significant international recognition. Firstly, just recognition of the legitimacy of what you are doing or trying to achieve, that it's a good objective. That already is a lot. So that's the third. The fourth is channeling the support that we get into tangible action. And tangible action could be a lot of things. A lot of tangible action is talking, is doing awareness, podcasts, doing things like that, or arranging conferences. But there are also some practical things that one could do, perhaps a strategic court case, litigation. I think there will increasingly be cases where we need some form of civil disobedience, people on a large scale deciding that they're not going to comply with something. That needs to be organized. So that type of tangible action. And then the fifth and final is creating de facto realities. And now there are other institutions doing that very well. we believe we can play a supportive role. And a practical example of that is where communities take over the functions that the government was supposed to be doing. Safety is a good example, or businesses doing business with each other or supporting each other regardless of BEE legislation and so forth. And I really think if we do these 5 things, I think it's not that unrealistic to achieve this. In other words, once again, proper research combined with local support, a growing local support for the idea, growing international support for the idea, tangible action, and creating de facto realities. And that's, as far as we are concerned, the 5 things that we need to do. And I'm actually quite excited. I'm not as pessimistic about the future as a lot of people I engage with.
Yeah, and I think excessive degrees of optimism and pessimism are actually recipes for inaction. So I think you have to have a sense of agency and the belief that you can actually affect change. But then you also have to be realistic about what is the operating environment in which you're trying to achieve that change.
I want to say something about optimism, because there's always this question, should you be an optimist or a pessimist? And then the answer is always no, you should be a realist. And I don't think that is really an answer. To me, optimism doesn't mean or shouldn't mean having blind faith that something is going to work. It shouldn't mean taking risks and then just hoping that it's going to work out how you want it to be. That's naive optimism. I think proper optimism is continually looking for opportunities, because it's always the case. When some doors shut, other doors open. And one can get very pessimistic when you see doors closing, when you see opportunities that you had in the past, you don't have them anymore. But we don't tend to see the doors that open up. And currently there's a lot of change happening in South Africa and in the world, and some doors are closing, but some doors are opening. And so optimism to me, or proper optimism, means looking for those opportunities and focusing on that. And I'm inspired by the David Lande's quote on optimism, where he says, the future belongs to the optimists, because it's easy to be a pessimist. It's easy to say it's not going to work, and then you sit back, and then it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, because you declare that it's not going to work, and then you don't do anything, and then it fails because you weren't involved. So, and then the great thing, or the best thing about being a pessimist is one day you can sit back and say, I was right, it didn't work. But that doesn't get you anywhere. And so the point about optimism is that if you become involved, if you look for the opportunities, and sometimes it fails, but then you look for the next opportunity and you focus on that. And eventually, that's why the conclusion is that eventually it's the optimists who win, it's not the pessimists.
If I can say something about the naive optimism aspect, which is, I mean, it's embodying us at the FMF for a while now, and I think the work you're doing speaks directly to this, I'm not sure if it's a view that most South Africans have, but it's a very persistent view that, okay, we voted, it didn't work, now to the next election, let's vote harder. Yeah. And then we vote, and then the political arithmetic changes significantly, like in 2024, but then we're like, oh, again, okay, it didn't work, next election. And it's interesting because I don't think there was any point in South Africa's history that an election brought about a fundamental change that improved things for, I mean, any interest group. You could look at the creation of the Union of South Africa. That was not the result of an election in the Transvaal or in the Cape Colony, etc. You can look at in the 1980s, Frederick van Zyl-Slabbert, who was the leader of the Progressive Party, Progressive Federal Party at the time, he resigned from parliament, making his party very, very mad when he said that, listen, we've now played the electoral game many times against apartheid, didn't work, nothing's happening. So he left parliament, and then within a few years, the whole constitutional structure changed, not because of the result of any election. So I think that there is a naive and in fact a very dangerous kind of optimism, and I'm not sure if we should call it an optimism. I'm not sure what we call it, but this dangerous idea that we just have to vote and then the rest will kind of work itself out. When in fact, as Ernst has said, the problem is far more fundamental. We need to have a broader policy discussion, not just about kind of items of public policy like BEE or expropriation without compensation, but like about the polity policy effectively, because that is really where real fundamental lasting change comes from. And if we can get a conversation going in South Africa about, yes, the ballot box is part of defending your interests, but increasingly more South Africans need to stop seeing it as their ultimate salvation, because that optimism really doesn't work, and that in fact you must channel your positive, your optimistic energies into kind of, you alluded to some of the work that's already being done, but like the solidarity movement. Actually saying we're optimistic about building a future for our people, going into communities, establishing structures, organizing, etc. That is where a lot of positive and optimistic energy has to be channeled, because that's where real change, I think, happens.
And so what's happening currently, I believe, is a general loss of trust and faith in the system, although I don't think people recognize that already, but you could say in politicians and in political parties. And you can see that in a few ways. One is voter turnout that has dropped from more than 80% to below 60% in this last election. Just the amount of people that actually go out to vote is eligible voters that just don't vote. And I guess one of the most important reasons is because they don't know that it makes much of a difference. And then even among people who actually vote, you find this increasing phenomenon of people who vote reluctantly. In other words, they would say things like, actually, I don't trust any of the political parties, but I'll vote for this one because it's sort of the least bad. And I think the underlying issue here is that people increasingly find that politicians don't solve the problems or can't solve the problems. And that's why I always go back to Thomas Sowell, who wrote extensively about this and who said that he wasn't, you said there was never such a case in South Africa, and you might even stretch it and say there was never such a case in the world. At least his argument was that he couldn't find any example of a community or a nation that was uplifted from poverty into affluence through politics, through legislation. So you just need the right law and then people become wealthy and successful. His line is that it's a combination of three things. It's hard work, it's skills development, and it's savings. So it's in many ways sort of a cultural thing or a constitutional thing in the small letter C, not the text of the constitution. It's what happens around the political system or around the electoral system that eventually shapes the political system, not the other way around. So it's this thing of de jure and de facto. De jure is what does the law say, and de facto is what's reality. And people tend to think that you change reality through the de jure route. You need to get a new law in place, you need to rewrite the text of the constitution, and then you get a new reality, when in fact it's the other way around. As reality changes, the law has to adapt to these changing circumstances. And that's why the de facto part is so important to us. And so what we see in South Africa is this void that is being created with a lack of leadership and so forth. And the void can be filled with, as Ernst van Zyl from AfriForum says, it's filled either with good guys or bad guys. And the bad guys are organized crime, it's mafias, it's crime syndicates and so forth. And the good guys are well-organized communities. And I think that filling the void should be a much higher priority for people. People should lay awake at night much more about what are we going to do to fill the void, because if we don't fill it, someone else is going to fill it, than about who am I going to vote for in the next election.
I mean, there is some void filling that is happening at a micro level. Like if you think of in many of the suburbs of Johannesburg, a lot of city services have essentially collapsed. There's gated communities, you have private security firms not only looking after the security of an area, but also picking up dogs and taking them to the kennels. And you now have private fire engine services that you can subscribe to through an app on your phone, whereas in the past it used to be the fire brigade from the city of Joburg. So there's these green shoots of this kind of alternative order, but I think scaling that is also the next challenge. Like, how do you start to build real alternative forms of order that are outside of these state systems?
Yeah, so David Roets made the joke once that if people ask him for, are there opportunities to invest and make money in South Africa, he would say yes. And then the question is where? And then he says, just look at what the government is supposed to be doing and invest in someone that's doing that, like private security or something. And so yes, there's a lot of void filling happening already, and I don't think even people recognize that. there's a lot of void filling happening on the dark side as well with construction mafias and gangs and so forth. But I think farm murders, for example, is down. It's not as much as high now as it was 5 years ago. And it's not because the police or the government have come to the table. It's because the farmers are better equipped. They are armed. They are trained. They have radios. They're in contact with each other. They have community patrols to a much higher extent than they had before. And the reason why the farm murders are down is not because the problem has gotten better or that there's some form of a political solution, but just people have started to fill the void that the police were supposed to be filling. But if the question is then how to scale that, I think there's an element of scaling happening already in the sense that security, as an example, where private security is more than double the police and the army combined at the moment. But I think in terms of leveling that up, that goes back to the local support, reaching out to different communities, because unfortunately, a lot of people in this country are trapped in this cycle of poverty and unemployment because they've become dependent on the government, and you have to get your social grants, and if you know the whole system there. So we need to build bridges and show to people that there's not some dark racist motive behind this. And one way to do that is through farming, through agriculture. There are many ways, but my experience, even though there's this stereotype of the brutal farmers and the white farmers are a bunch of racists, that's sort of the political stereotype. But in my experience, it's especially commercial farmers who are very keen and committed to outreach programs, to helping young upcoming black farmers and cooperating and so forth. And I think we need more of that, but outside the realm of the government. When the government becomes involved, it fails. So there needs to be this sort of outreach between communities. I think that's the most important next step to get to a sort of a scaled filling the void.
Yeah, I wrote a column recently where I said this phrase that we use in South Africa, the government must do X. We need to stop using that phrase.
Yeah.
Because there's a paradox, because everybody sees that everything the government touches just turns to ruin. And yet we still reflexively want the government to do more and more things.
Yeah.
And there are many problems in a complex society like ours that won't necessarily be solved by the government, even a benevolent, well-intentioned government, which we don't exactly have at the moment.
Exactly. So it's a two-tier problem. It's a government that has bad intentions or its own ideological objectives. The other side of it is the competency. So even if they wanted to do something about the problem, the question is if they would actually be able to do something about the problem. So it's just not sustainable. And so when I was with AfriForum, we had this conversation a lot, how to respond to, I mentioned the farmer tax. Because on the one hand, the one argument is we pay taxes, and if we pay taxes, the government must do the following. It's social contract. So we are fulfilling our part of the deal or the contract, now they should fulfill their part. And so in as far as you start taking over these functions, you're still paying taxes. So actually you're doing what the government's supposed to be doing. But it's a downward spiral to argue like that, because it gets you nowhere. It gets you to apathy, to waiting for the government to come to the table. And I think the way to break that cycle is to start doing the things that the government is supposed to be doing, or that you thought the government is supposed to be doing. And then I think the tax issue might be sorted out later, but you need to create that de facto reality where you are paying taxes, but you're doing all of these things already, and then you can ask the question, but what do we do with the tax? It doesn't start with questioning the tax or trying to demand something because of the tax.
And that gives you actual power, negotiating power.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, so I was this morning watching a conversation that you had on your podcast with Celia Brink.
Oh, yeah.
And Celia always strikes me as a very thoughtful, capable person. But even somebody of his caliber has, I think, experienced great difficulty in running a complex city like Tshwane, which I think is one of the largest metropolitan areas in the world.
6,000 square kilometers.
Yeah,
more than 6,000.
Which is like a little country. If you think about it.
Yeah.
And we have many examples in South Africa of cities that have completely collapsed, municipalities, small towns as well in the Platteland. And so how do we start to rethink governance at the local level? And letting this principle of decentralization guide us. And if you look at the city of Cape Town, I mean, it's often held up as a model of good governance in South Africa, head and shoulders above other municipalities. They still have significant social problems in that part of the world. Gang violence is running rampant. And Mayor Jordan Hill-Lewis has argued, well, we need a legislative change to the SAPS Act to add 2 words, which is "and investigate." And the relevant clause that he refers to says that the city police must have the powers to prevent and investigate crime. Now, Martin, you've argued that perhaps he should have a bit of more of a broader definition of crime prevention. And, I think waiting for the National Assembly to pass legislative changes, you might wait for a very long time. And meanwhile, young people, various people in the community are being slaughtered en masse through gang violence.
Yeah,
and so there's a great urgency to act. And so how do we start to rethink how we allocate power in that way?
Yeah, I mean, Ernst mentioned that that's the road to apathy. I think it's the exact same principle. I mean, you're going to wait forever for the National Assembly. It's simply not going to happen. The ANC, and I don't blame the ANC for this. The ANC came to power in this country in 1994 saying that we are a centralist organization and we do not believe in decentralization. So for anyone to be like, oh, how dare they centralize? It's like, no, they're doing what they promised they would do. So I'm not mad at the ANC. I disagree with them fundamentally. But then for well-meaning political actors in this country to be like, okay, we've sent a letter to the Speaker of the National Assembly to please consider this legislation that gives us the power to actually solve some real problems tangibly. That is setting not just yourself up for failure. I mean, it's fine for you to fail as a political actor, but you are signing the death warrants. You are signing the death warrants of thousands of people in your gangland hotspot. I mean, the Cape Flats are the most dangerous place on this continent, I think, by far. So
I once heard a stat, it seems too bad to be true, that in one of those areas, there was on average 1 murder on every 20 square meters in a year. That's in one of those sort of gang-infested areas.
And it's horrible, and the horribleness of it is kind of emphasized by the fact that this is a solvable problem. The thing with criminals is that they stop when they meet resistance. That is how criminals function. These are not soldiers. They're not trained to press through and with tactics and so on. When they meet resistance, they pull back. South Africa's communities in general do not resist because they're waiting. They are waiting for the police. They are waiting for their armed response. So, and then we in our roadshow, the Campaign for Home Rule last year, we discovered that in fact where local communities have something called a special ratings area, for instance, it's a very limited form of kind of municipal self-governance, their crime collapses. It's gone. It falls basically to zero just because they put up a boom gate and a guard sits and kind of sleeps there in a hut. There's a perception of resistance, and violent crime in those areas almost collapses entirely unless you come up against real organized crime. So this is a very tangibly, immediately solvable problem inside the Cape Flats, inside Cape Town and across the country. And under such circumstances to say, no, but we will wait for some policy reform to enable that, that strikes me as very reckless, and it doesn't actually solve the problem. You're in some way misrepresenting the state of play to your constituents. So I think that, and Ernst mentioned civil disobedience, and I'm glad you did, because that is what it ultimately comes down to. This is a valid form of political engagement. It is, in fact, sometimes for lesser magistrates, let's say, like a mayor or a province, to tell the greater magistrate of the country government, we actually have a social contract. We have a democratic responsibility to our constituents to protect them against these things that you are allowing to happen to them. So take your written law and sit on it for a while. We are going to solve this issue for now. And in my view, I think a court would be very reluctant, for example, to reverse such a thing. I am not going to put it past South Africa's courts, but there is ultimately a lot that can be done on the ground, even if it doesn't check every box of formality.
And so that's about recognizing that there is a higher order of values that you represent. You don't necessarily need to wait for permission for everything. I mean, I understand why people maybe in the city of Cape Town or Western Cape provincial administration might be reluctant to be breaching the law because that might incur some kind of risk or political blowback. But the stakes are very high, and it is something. I mean, I remember there was this issue around vagrancy around the fort in Cape Town, and the mayor was determined to fight that in the courts. And this is an analogous problem, I think, is act and then litigate retrospectively. I think there's a lot to be said for that strategy.
I remember in my first year LLB at the University of Pretoria, we had a lesson on positive law as opposed to natural law. This idea of looking at the letter of the law as opposed to thinking about some form of a higher order. And it was explained to us in a very bizarre way. I remember the slides. There was a picture of Hendrik Verwoerd and Nelson Mandela. And then under Verwoerd, it said legal positivism. And then under Mandela, it said natural law.
Wow.
So,
okay.
yeah. So
They should have had legal positivism for each.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter if it's sinners or
I
saints.
doubt either of them would describe themselves in such terms.
Yeah, exactly. And so I was first year, and I thought, this is strange. And the more I read about it, the more I realized just how bizarre it is. But the irony is that the thing is that we're actually calling on some form of recognizing that legal positivism is not always the solution. In other words, just looking at what does the text say and waiting for that to bring a solution. And that was the ANC's argument during the 80s and the 90s, that there are certain laws that we're not complying with. We won't comply with that because we regard them as immoral, or we believe that there's some form of a higher order. And so that has always been, I think, a part of how justice systems ought to function. Now, again, whether South African courts would agree or not is another thing, but there have been some interesting cases already. I'm thinking about the Eastern Cape case where the farmers just eventually fixed the roads themselves and then sued the government to compensate them for doing that. And I think we're going to see more of that. We have very ideological judges, unfortunately, but it becomes increasingly difficult to just ignore reality. And when people are trying to do something to solve problems in the real world, and maybe if I can give another example, maybe at my own to my own detriment, among more conservative Afrikaner circles, and obviously I regard myself as conservative, but there's a lot of talk about Section 235 in the Constitution, the self-determination clause, which you can have a long debate about what does that clause actually mean, and because it's written in a strange way. But I think the wrong way to think about that clause, because the clause more or less boils down to you have a right to self-determination. The wrong way to deal with that clause is to say we need to go to court for some form of a declaratory order to explain to us what that clause means, and to give us an order that says, yes, you as a cultural community have a right to self-determination. Because what would much rather happen is the court would interpret that in a way that sort of suits the ANC narrative. And at the end of the day, you are left with much less room to maneuver than you had. I think the appropriate way to deal with a clause like that is to recognize that there is provision for self-determination, great stuff, but we're going to continue to create that just in the real world, as opposed to waiting for a court to give it to us.
Yeah, so Ernst, you've been traveling quite a lot over the last year or so, and I'd like you to speak about what your intentions are with your engagements with the international community, for want of a better term, and the role that international pressure can play in facilitating constructive change here in South Africa.
Yes, so I actually didn't expect that the international stuff would be such a big focus of mine, but I enjoy doing it. And I think, as I mentioned earlier, it's very important to get international recognition for what you're doing. International recognition by itself is not going to fix the problem, but it is a building block towards a solution. And there are a few things there that I think is important. One, and probably the most important thing, is somewhat symbolic, perhaps a little bit more than symbolic, but it's just growing international recognition that this thing that we are pursuing, in other words, self-governance or autonomy, is legitimate, it's worth pursuing, and it's a noble cause, as opposed to some sinister or some bad faith political goal. Having that recognition, I think, is already good. Other than that, there's a lot that one can achieve through diplomatic pressure in terms of the situation we are in currently. And I think we're starting to see that with the Trump administration, but I think it's going to increase. Over time, it might go up and down a bit, but I hope and I believe that there's going to be more international pressure on things like BEE coming from the West and corruption, and because the sort of the honeymoon period for South Africa is over. And we've learned from the ANC just how important international pressure is. And not so much just speaking out. One of the most significant events that isn't as well remembered today that eventually led to the collapse of the apartheid system was not so much the ANC speaking at meetings abroad, but Chase Manhattan saying that they're not going to renew their loans to the South African government and the consequences thereof. So I believe the international pressure is an important building block, in some ways symbolically, but in other ways I think there are some real tangible things. If we can get, for example, preconditions to trade agreements, stronger preconditions to loans, the extensions of loans and so forth. And so yes, we can borrow you money, but you need to show to us that there's an effort to move away from these discriminatory race laws and so forth. I think these things are very important. It's not a complete solution, but it's a very important part of the solution.
And what is your reading of the Trump administration's actions against South Africa, the executive order in February, other engagements like in the White House in May? How do you see the Trump administration's view of the situation here?
Well, I think it seems to us that there are three reasons why this focus on South Africa is in America's interest, other than the fact that South Africa is sort of once again becoming an interesting country, and other than the fact that a lot of people who have left South Africa to, for example, the USA, have had some influence in the USA. Trump himself mentioned his friends from South Africa who speak to him about what's happening. So other than all of these, sort of the personal level, I think there are three reasons why it's in America's interest. The first is mitigating anti-American and anti-Western actions by the South African government, which is, for example, among the top 10 countries in the world that most consistently votes against the United States at the United Nations. It's trying to build this alliance with Cuba and Venezuela and Zimbabwe, all these countries with the worst human rights records. And also the way the South African government is trying to use BRICS as sort of an anti-Western platform, lashing out against Trump and the American administration and so forth. So there's some clear anti-American and anti-Western actions by the South African government, not even going to the Israel case. The second is that in South Africa, there are communities that are pro-America and pro-Western, that want good relations with America, that have friends in America and so forth. And these people are, to a large extent, targeted, and to a large extent because of the fact that they are Westerners. And so that also is an element that is important to people in America. And then the third is preventing the potential disastrous consequences that could sprout from a really destabilized South Africa, because South Africa is bordered by countries that are in many ways economically either dependent or sort of interwoven with South Africa. So if South Africa collapses, if we have a Zimbabwe type situation, it's going to be bad for all our neighboring countries. It's going to be bad for sub-Saharan Africa, which will be destabilized, partly due to the fact that we have South Africa is pulling immigration from Africa to the south at the moment. If South Africa collapses, that immigration is going to go up to the north. And so it's going to lead to higher waves of immigration into Europe and into America and so forth. And another consequence of that would be that it opens the door to forces that are somewhat, you could say, antagonistic to the West, China and other the Middle Eastern countries and so forth, that are interested in resources in South Africa and sort of strengthening its grip on the African continent. So it's not just the American interest in South Africa is not just because it's interesting. But I think there are some real tangible reasons why it is in America's interest to have not a destabilized South Africa, but to have a stabilized South Africa, and in pursuing that.
And I think I just to add to that, because a lot of people immediately try to make this a Trump thing. I mean, Donald Trump has a very strong personality, kind of a magnetic personality for all sorts of issues. But we need to remember that the Lady R incident happened during Joe Biden's administration. It's not like the Democratic Party in the US is like head over heels in love with what South Africa has been doing. So there's a lot of shared concerns in the American political scene about South Africa. Obviously, the Republicans, I think, are a lot more explicit about these things and maybe a lot more determined to see it through. But I think there is an impression amongst a lot of South African political commentators that, we just have to bide our time. The moment that Donald Trump leaves office, all is well. We're going to have a good relationship with the US again. AGOA will be renewed kind of consistently and so on. I think that is probably a very naive way to see it. I think that the US specifically, maybe less so Europe, but the US specifically has for a long time been quite upset about how South Africa positions itself on various geopolitical issues. So I just think that's an important thing to note about the magnetism of Donald Trump in all of this.
You've also spent a lot of time in Europe. What are some of your reflections?
Yeah, I think what's happening in Europe is interesting. There's sort of, you could say, conservative revival in a certain sense, where all the what is described as right-wing parties are growing in the polls and all the others are sort of shrinking. And there's a growing sense of recognition that the West is under attack, and there's some real existential threats to Western civilization. If we want to preserve this, we need to take a stance. Now, these different institutions don't necessarily all agree on how to do that and how to frame that, and some are sort of more radical and some are more moderate. But this notion that we need to have a higher sense of pride in who we are and speak out against these things that were regarded as politically incorrect for the last few decades is certainly strengthening and increasing. And what I also see happening, especially with a country like Hungary, that is almost deliberately trying to position itself as the conservative capital of the world, in the sense that they keep hosting these international conferences and then they invite people from all over. And which obviously provide wonderful networking opportunities. But what is interesting to see there is that there's this momentum that is being built in terms of, you could say, an international conservative movement that recognizes that we should also support each other. And so what I thought was quite funny is maybe earlier this year, could have been last year, Elon Musk was very critical of Keir Starmer on X, and then people responded and said, that's another country, it has nothing to do with you, keep your mouth out of, or your nose out of our country. And he then made a Twitter poll and he said, should I stop expressing my concerns about England and Keir Starmer? And people overwhelmingly voted for him to keep talking about England. But I think the underlying thing here is not so much the conventional wisdom that states have territorial autonomy and we need to recognize that and keep your mouth shut when you disagree with what's happening in another country. I think what's starting to happen here is that in sort of the Western world, there's a recognition that we're all under threat, but just in different ways, and we need to support each other. And what I see happening is that Western countries are increasingly outspoken about what's happening in other Western countries. And I think in a sense it's a good thing. It's a good thing that, because what sort of underpins that is the idea that we're all under threat in some ways from the same ideologies or the same problems. And again, the circumstances are somewhat different in each country, but we need to support each other. And I think that's part of the reason why South Africa is also being rediscovered. There's recognition that there's actually a few million people in South Africa who you could describe as Westerners, even though we're not Europeans, we don't live in Europe and so forth, but who are also worthy of some form of protection. And it's also honorable and it's the right thing to do to take a stance in favor of these people.
And many of the principles that we espouse, individual freedom, the rule of law, separation of powers,
freedom in the marketplace.
These are concepts that have interwoven the Western tradition for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And those are principles worth defending. All right, so Ernst, just a final word. You've mentioned some of the other alternative forms of governance that perhaps have these elements of decentralization, consociationalism,
Yeah.
confederalism, more explicit federal structures. What do you think would be, as you read it, a potential answer for some of the governance and other issues that we have in South Africa?
Yeah, so first off, I think we need to talk about these different models much more to break this narrative that you can only choose between ANC, democracy in quotation marks, or National Party, apartheid. It's one of the two, and if you don't want what's happening now, it means you want apartheid. If you don't want apartheid, you want what's happening now.
So a false binary.
Exactly, and so to break that by saying there are actually many different systems that one can look at. One, of course, is federalism, like we have in the United States or Switzerland with a canton system, with a central government that is much more decentralized. In other words, that there's significant amounts of autonomy for the various states or for the cantons. And then you have confederalism, and maybe an example of that could be the European Union, in the sense that the countries that live in the countries in Europe govern themselves, but there's some form of a central coordinating body. That's an example. And what I also find interesting is the idea of territorial autonomy and cultural autonomy and the difference between the two. And I actually think some form of a combination between the two could be a solution for South Africa. So the good example, there are many examples of territorial autonomy, but an example that has become well known is South Tyrol, which is a province in the north of Italy inhabited by people who call themselves Tyroleans, not Germans, although they speak German. But they regard themselves as the Tyrolean people. But they inhabit the province, they're a majority of the people there, and they have, as a result of some friction with the national government, come to a conclusion or to a place where they have what they call an autonomous province. So they have their own parliament, they make their own laws, they are part of Italy, but they have a high degree of autonomy, and they have a significant say over how their tax money is spent. And so I think but there are other examples, the Nunavut in Canada, there are examples in Finland, and there are examples all over. Scotland is perhaps an example of that in the context of the United Kingdom. And then there are examples of cultural autonomy, which is somewhat different. That is to say, some of those Scandinavian countries, Estonia, Finland also have such systems which says or recognizes that there are diverse peoples living in this country who have, for example, schools in different languages. And we need to recognize this even though they are spread out across the country. And one way to do that is to give these communities the authority to make certain decisions on institutions that affect their own communities. Like the Afrikaans community decides what happens in Afrikaans schools, as just to make it very practical. And I think, so the difference there is with territorial autonomy, it's about a community that lives in one area where they form a majority, they de facto control that territory. Cultural autonomy is more sort of a system that recognizes that there are different communities in this territory, and they should have a bigger say over, they could have their own sort of council that decides on their own affairs. And maybe some form of a combination between the two is something that's worth pursuing. I do think, however, and our approach at Lex Libertas for now is not to look at all these sort of this menu and say that's the one we're going to pursue, because if you look at these different options, many of them could be applicable and some more than others. But I think what's important now is to open up the conversation about these different systems and about the efficacy thereof. Does it work where it is in place? Could it work in South Africa? And to have sort of some form of a process towards that, as opposed to trying to preempt it and say that's where we need to go. But to have that broad discussion and say we need to promote self-governance, and that could happen in a variety of ways. And here are our options, and this is broadly what we think ought to happen.
Yeah, and I think these things are complex because you're dealing with human relations, which are not replicable from one jurisdiction to another. And in many respects, during the 90s, the constitutional drafting process was a bit of this buffet kind of, like, let's take a bit of Germany and a bit of Canada and just kind of mash it together.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I think there are many examples in Europe. You mentioned Switzerland, where there is a kind of a very maybe loosely held overarching Swiss identity in the sense of Swiss sovereignty and great degrees of individual freedom as well, but a recognition that the French-speaking community, the German-speaking community, the Italian-speaking, the Roma, they have their own traditions, their own customs that need to be upheld and respected.
And they don't feel, and they shouldn't feel that there's some form of a competition or a friction between them, that in order for us to get what we want, we need to destroy what they want. And that's why some form of a parallelism is necessary.
Yeah, my wife and I once went hiking through Basque country in Spain. And, the Basque people, it is a linguistic isolate. That language is not connected to any other language. It's very unique, and a lot of their cultural institutions, even their rail system or whatever, is controlled by the Basque people themselves, and yet they form part of the territorial sovereignty of Spain.
Yeah.
So there's many ways of ordering our affairs, to create prosperity and freedom for people.
But I just want to add or emphasize the point you made is about, also about talking about this and recognizing people have agency and there's a process that has to be followed. It's not the type of thing where you can simply just decide from the get-go that's what we need to do, because there needs to be a process and the people need to be on board, and people need to think about these things and have conversations about these things. And so that's actually our most important short-term goal at Lex Libertas. We have two goals. The one is an internal goal where we need to find, it's a new institution, so we need to be financially sustainable. That's our internal goal. And for that, we're recruiting contributors and so forth. And our external goal is we want to bring the discussion about autonomy and self-governance back into the mainstream conversation. And we believe it's measurable to an extent, that you can see the extent to which people are willing to discuss these issues. And opening up the conversation, I believe, is the most important thing that needs to happen now.
And I think that your work is, you're living up to that goal, and we're very much admiring of your efforts in that regard. And I think that that's a fitting place for us to end this conversation. But Ernst Roets, I just wanted to thank you very much for sharing your insights with us today. And I think there are no off-the-shelf solutions here. This is a process of discovery, and I think through conversations like this, we can discover better ways of living our lives here in South Africa.
Thank you very much, David and Martin. It's a great conversation. I appreciate it.
Thanks for watching this conversation with Ernst Roets. We'll be keen to hear your thoughts down in the comment section. Please don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel as well. And also, if you would like to contribute financially to the Free Market Foundation, we'd be grateful for your support. There's a link in the description below where you can find out how to donate. My name is David Ansara. Remember, stay free.